I'm Dr. Kerry McInerney. Dr. Eleanor Drage and I are the hosts of the Good Robot podcast. Join us as we ask the experts, what is good technology? Is it even possible? And how can feminism help us work towards it? If you want to learn more about today's topic, head over to our website, www.thegoodrobot.co.uk, where we've got a full transcript of the episode and a specially curated reading list by every guest. We love hearing from listeners, so feel free to tweet or email us, and we'd also so appreciate you leaving us a review on the podcast app. But until then, sit back, relax, and enjoy the episode. In this episode, we talk to Beryl Pong, head of the Centre for Drones and Culture at the Leverhulme Centre for the Future of Intelligence. We discuss how Beryl's background in literature and cultural studies helps her read and understand technologies like drones. We talk about what a drone is, whether or not there can be good drones, and how this differs from the political project of Drones for Good. We also explore together what we learn by thinking about drones through the lens of aesthetic and culture, the problems that arise from using drones in different humanitarian settings, the perils of deploying military technologies like drones into the civilian sphere, and finally, how drones are being integrated into popular culture through their use in film, TV, and unique cultural productions like drone light shows. We hope you enjoy the episode. Brilliant. Well, thank you so much for joining us here today. It's a real pleasure to have you. So just to kick us off, could you tell us a little bit about who you are, what you do, and what brings you to thinking about gender, feminism, and technology?
Thanks very much for having me. I'm a fan of your podcast, so it's an honor to be here. I'm an academic. I'm a researcher. I'm currently funded by UK Research and Innovation as a Future Leaders Fellow to tackle a big project about drone ethics and its relationship to drone aesthetics. So as part of that project, I established and I run what's called the Centre for Drones and Culture. It's based at the University of Cambridge, and it brings together a community of cross-disciplinary researchers, including politics, digital media, computer sciences, to think about how drones are impacting on different facets of everyday life and society. My own background is in English literature and visual culture and cultural studies, so sometimes this does seem a bit far out from what I'm currently researching and working on. But I've always been interested in matters of form, so how in literary criticism speak, the relationship between the form of an object or the form of a text or of writing, the relationship to content, right? What it's trying to convey, the meanings that it's expressing. So increasingly, I've been thinking about how form and content in technology could complement or maybe be in tension with each other. And this is kind of what motivates my understanding of technology from the angle of finding more socially just expressions and uses for it. And that might be the link to feminism, I think.
You see, listeners, literature is a transferable skill.
I know.
A great degree.
It's quite provocative. And I did a while back have an argument somewhere saying that it's kind of a formal take on technology, right? We usually think of texts and writing as close reading. What if we treated technology itself as something that needed to be closely read? What about its nuances? Who's reading it? How is it being read? Where is it being produced, published, / being disseminated? If we can kind of learn to engage with it as if it is accessible to us, like reading, maybe we can have better relationships with its ethics.
Well, that's a perfect segue into our big robot questions. What is good technology? Is it even possible? And how can feminism help us get there? And perhaps a good technology then is one that can be closely read and interpreted. What do you think?
I think that would be a way to start. I think we do tend to have ready ideas about dystopian visions for what we don't want in technology, right? But we're not very good at embracing or being vulnerable about what we think is desirable and hopeful and worth reaching for. So instead of repeating the truism that technologies are neither good nor bad, it's only about how you use them, I've been thinking about this question in terms of how we can assess for ourselves in kind of maybe context-specific scenarios whether a technology might be good or might be bad. And here I'll lean on an old article from Langdon Winner because I've kind of gone back to him for another article of mine recently. It's called Do Artifacts Have Politics? And he points out, I'm paraphrasing here, that scientific knowledge, technological innovation, and corporate motivations and profit, these three reinforce each other. And they can do so in deeply entrenched patterns that then bear the stamp of political and economic power. So he suggests that political effects of many new technologies depend on the broader political regimes into which they are born or imagined or inserted, and that new technologies become meaningful and they're captured by these regimes that the tech then comes to reproduce. So from my perspective, to start thinking about what is good technology in the first place, I think we need to think about the affordance of the technology, how it's designed, what are its properties materially, its capabilities, how do these encourage particular uses and interactions, right? That's not neutral. And then second, we need to think about the contours of the socio-political regimes in which that technology will nest and will reside, right? And then thirdly, we need to consider how the technology will interact with those regimes. Are they going to co-constitute or reinforce those power hierarchies and asymmetries? Or do they have the capacity to resist them or to ask people to rethink some of those logics?
To go even more specific, what is a drone? And your answer got me thinking about whether there can be good drones. And this is terribly subjective, but perhaps you can answer those two things together.
Yes, that's a really good segue into whether text can be good, because I can think of numerous books titled The Good Drone, as if just to say the drone, it's this kind of reflexive feeling that's already negative and we need to append something to ameliorate that. So a drone is an unmanned vehicle or system, usually controlled autonomously. Drones can operate in different geographies, including the air, on land, on and underwater, and in newer frontiers, possibly in outer space. People are exploring ways of using unmanned systems in all of these realms. Most commonly, we think of drones as those that are in the air, called UAVs or unmanned aerial vehicles, because these have been developing for some time and they're the ones that are most accessible, both in terms of everyday imagining. You see a lot of flying unmanned aerial vehicles, for instance, when people are trying to take photographs of themselves from the air. But they're also most accessible because they are the cheapest. They are the ones that are kind of closest to civil society, I think. Beyond the drone as the flying object, there is a bigger assemblage involved in what a drone is. It might include cameras, sensors like LiDAR, infrared, software and navigation systems. So some would say that the drone itself is an assemblage of all of those things. For me, an important thing that distinguishes a drone from something that's just remotely piloted is that there is a payload, right? It has a capacity to carry something. Sometimes it's very small, it's a little sensor, you might not see it. And sometimes it's big. So with military defense drones, it might be something like a Hellfire missile. But the capacity to carry something and what that signifies, that to me is an important aspect of what a drone is. And I should answer now whether drones are good, shouldn't I?
What do you think? Can there be a good drone in your view?
I think there can be. I think there can be good drones. But if we go back to the affordance question, a drone is about being able to be somewhere where you as the user physically does not need to be, right? And that is the baseline consideration and opportunity that the drone offers. So when you think about it like that, I think you need to think about whether that prosthetic relationship is desirable. Do you want to be able to do something, see something, know something from the perspective of remote sensing, from the perspective of not being there? And in some contexts, that is more straightforward. Nowadays, a lot of people use drones to manage nuclear energy, for instance. It's just much safer than having manned labor. But sometimes it's less straightforward, for instance, in terms of drone monitoring over sites of forced migration, for instance. You want to be able to have a picture or capture information about what's happening below, but is it really giving you the motivations, the stories, the political circumstances behind why this movement happens? That doesn't answer your question, does it?
However you want to answer it. I think, I like the way that you talked about utility. Like, does it do what it purports to do? And actually, probably not. We don't have to necessarily think about ethics when we talk about that. But I think what you're saying is that even the thing that it says that it will do, it doesn't necessarily do because it doesn't give you enough context to actually be able to make decisions.
Yes, exactly. And I think what a good drone is not drones for good. if I can put it that way. So there's a whole discourse and movement around drones for good that is about how do we use a drone in a way that serves some kind of socio-political benefit, but capital and profit has to be a part of it being good, right? It's often in service of starting up or providing some kind of proof of concept for something that will generate wealth or economic profit for someone, as if the good is just kind of appended. So I just think a good drone is not drones for good. A good drone would be a drone that understands the limitations of itself as a remote sensing object and highlights that aspect of what it is to the user. It is not a drone that is good just because it is being used by a startup for some kind of socio-political benefit elsewhere while making money for the company.
Absolutely. And I think there's really interesting parallels here with the AI for good movement and the critiques that were made of that movement. There was such an emphasis, I think, a few years ago on like all the different ways that we could develop and deploy like AI and machine learning in these like kind of like socially justice or like kind of social benefit oriented ways, which sounds like a great idea and totally unobjectionable. But in practice, it cleaves so much more strongly to the model that you've described, Beryl, of like, actually, this is about kind of a justifiable testing ground for new products that tend to then get commodified and scaled in maybe less beneficial ways. Or I think the strongest parallel is with the sort of AI for sustainability push, which was then kind of challenged in this idea of, oh, okay, well, AI is theoretically going to help us solve all these kind of catastrophic climate problems, but AI itself is extremely environmentally destructive through its supply chain, through its energy use, and also through all these different questions of what it means to recycle technological hardware. But I wanted to actually come back to something that you mentioned at the beginning of this episode, which is your background in literary studies and literary criticism and how that shapes the way that you think about drones and other technologies. And so at the Center for Drones and Culture, culture is at the heart of how you think about drones and drone use. And you also focus a lot on drone aesthetics. And so I wanted to ask you about the idea of drone aesthetics. What is it, and why do you think it's so essential to think about drones through this cultural lens?
We often tend to think of drones and their ethical questions in terms of technicities. And in fact, that's often how tech is regulated, I think. But I think aesthetics brings an important lens. I think of aesthetics oftentimes in three dimensions. Because of my background, I think of aesthetics as art or as cultural products that we just coexist with in everyday life. But I also think of aesthetics in terms of the 18th century conception of aesthetics, which is this relationship between the mind, the body, and the external environment. Things have an aesthetics or an aesthetic dimension to it, and our encounter with those aesthetics is part of how we interpret what it is, why it should belong there, what it's doing. And that has consequences for a third way of understanding aesthetics, which is politics, right? Understanding the aesthetics of something allows us to see, what context made it come into being, who profited, benefited, or suffered from this coming into being. And if we're able to see some of those questions through an artwork or through a speculative cultural product that tells a different story, counterfactual story about a technology or a history, then maybe that opens new political avenues that we couldn't have thought about before. I think back to foundational work in cultural studies that define culture as a system of representation with the power to signify, which is not a neutral force, right? That all representations are in part products of, but also productive of power hierarchies and asymmetries. So culture can help make those trends visible, I think. And they're important because they're accessible in mundane ways to you and me and to anybody just walking around on the street.
From the aesthetic to the humanitarian, I know that from a friend of mine who works for the World Food Programme and said that there was lots of suspect use of technologies there, from biometrics to drones, which I shouldn't talk about because I don't want to get her into trouble. But can you tell us about the humanitarian use of drones? And I think that probably connects to what you were saying about drones for good and the impossibility of that. How are they being used and what's the issue?
Depends on the humanitarian setting, but drones are often used for mapping damage from environmental disaster zones, for instance. That's where the affordance of the remote sensing capabilities come into play. It can be used for search and rescue operations, and in fact, it is used for drug and medicine delivery as well, often to reach remote or hard to excess places. I'm currently speaking with some peace-building organizations who stress and insist to me on how important drones are to helping them manage and monitor ceasefires, among other fraught geopolitical situations. So these are situations that wouldn't be safe to have a person there, but there are political consequences, or places where there are political consequences to actually having a person there in the first place, right? So all of these, I think, are good and worthwhile uses of humanitarian drones. On the other hand, there can be problems with the humanitarian uses of drones. Drones are often used as data gathering devices. So there's always this perennial question about privacy and consent. What information is being gathered? Are people consenting to be photographed or filmed or mapped, right? If they are the data that is being captured. There's also a fundamental asymmetry to the drone, I think, that is part of what it is. The person who uses or operates or manages the drone always has some kind of power that's different to being the person who's captured or seen or documented in some way by the drone. It's an asymmetry that parties have to work with, I think. And this matters a lot for humanitarian drone journalism, for instance. A lot of drone photographers I know have to work against the affordance of distance and anonymity, right? Even though the technology makes it easy to be anonymous, to be distant, and therefore to capture images at scale, for instance, that tells one kind of story. And often humanitarian journalists, that's not the only story they want to tell. So the ones that I know of will actively try to work against the technology by, carrying the drone down and then going down to talk to people and explaining, this is what I'm going to do, this is how it works. Do you consent? Are you okay with me capturing your story in this way? So that's something extra that they do, right? It's not easy to do. They can just fly the drone and do their job like that, but they decide consciously to work against that. One more problem with humanitarian drone use that's worth thinking about as it's a field that's developing and maturing is that the space is often founded upon Western funded experiments with the technology, often at sites that are formerly colonized that have less regulations around how technologies should be used. So one prominent player in humanitarian drone space is a startup from Silicon Valley, but really developed its technology in places like Rwanda, Nigeria, Kenya, Cote d'Ivoire, and now it's being doled out and brought back to places like the United States, for instance. And, is it worth us thinking about where these geographies lie and what role they've played to enable a particular Western startup to find success? These are complicated stories that I think people need to bear in mind.
I really like the way that you bring out the complexity in a lot of these stories, because I think it's very easy, to be like full kind of techno-optimist, like, wow, this sounds like such a great idea. Let's use drones for food delivery, or let's, just start trying to apply drones to these very complicated humanitarian problems willy-nilly. And yeah, it's also very easy, I think, to be completely kind of dismissive of the possibilities that could arise from tech use, even when there might be evidence to say, actually, maybe there are some places where using drones in certain humanitarian settings could be potentially really useful or grapple with very distinct problems. Or, I think about this a lot in relation to, say, the use of drones for, say, detecting and diffusing landmines. I lived briefly as a child in a place where landmines was just a really, really big issue. And it's one of those technology uses where I sometimes think wow, actually there can be, forms of deployment that maybe actually do really help us kind of deal with some of the ongoing effects of conflict. But I think what you bring out so beautifully are those ambivalences around, even when it seems like there's a good use, there's all sorts of other kinds of structural inequalities and power problems that play out on those terrains at the same time. But I want to kind of move us from, I guess, these conflict settings or these particular settings that we might associate with war through to another kind of major sphere of drone use, which is the domestic or the civilian use of drones. So drones, come from military origins, still heavily used in military sites, but I think drones are increasingly a part now of everyday civilian life. It's not uncommon to see people playing with drones in public spaces, flying them at low levels. I've never owned a drone, but I'm sure a lot of our listeners, maybe you either have owned one or you know someone who owns one. But I was wondering, Beryl, if you could reflect a little bit on, what are the consequences of taking a military technology like the drone and deploying it in everyday life?
I think one initial thought is that some people will say military drones are very different from civilian drones, right? There is the big, expensive defense drone that's we don't know much about, that's stealthy, that can fly for a really long time, that loiters. And then there's the civilian small quadcopter, whirs very loudly, sounds like a pest above your head. And some would say they're completely different technologies altogether, and we shouldn't lump them together. And while I agree with some of that reasoning, I think what we're beginning to see, in addition to the diversification of what a drone is in the first place, we're beginning to see how military drones are used in civilian contexts. So they're being used for policing, for instance. I think back to the Black Lives Matter protests in 2020 when the U.S. CPD, Customs and Border Agency, they flew a military Predator drone to survey the protests over Minneapolis, right? And then on the flip side, we're seeing civilian commercial drones that aren't meant for military use at all, like DJI drones that we use for hobbyist photography or drone racing if we want. Those are being tinkered, hacked, and repurposed for nefarious spaces like Ukraine, Russia. Apparently, a DJI drone is the weapon of choice in Ukraine-Russia conflict because it's cheap, it's easy, it's attributable. You can lose it without losing a lot of money, without losing a lot of information, in fact. And so there's this kind of melding between the military and civilian spaces that I find is really urgent to grapple with today. And I think one domestic sphere that we can think about these implications might be in policing. So the implications of bringing military technologies into civilian spheres becomes quite clearer on that front, I think, because we tend to think of military deployments and military uses as somewhat exceptional, as being bounded by their own rules, sometimes their own laws. There's a particular exertion of force there that justifies its use that doesn't exist in regular, mundane, everyday spheres, right? Whereas policing is an everyday event. It is an everyday event that is meant in the spirit of prevention or preemption, right? And when you bring discourses about exceptionality into the everyday and the mundane, such that it becomes part of the fabric of everyday life, it becomes harder to critique those power asymmetries, those hierarchies, and those conflicts of interest that might undergird the use of that tech in the first place.
That's a really great explanation of why it's a problem not to think deeply about using technologies that come from military contexts, in our day-to-day lives, and what effect that might have. And on your point on Ukraine and the drone use there, I remember Victoria Vodichenko saying that the world should look to Ukraine for ways of repurposing these technologies, like the future of war, and how these technologies can be deployed for public gain.
Can I just say quickly that I think increasingly drones are looking like something like IEDs or improvised explosive devices, where it's increasingly hard to define what they are. I think of another space where drones are used, which is in Myanmar and the ongoing conflicts there from the junta against its own people. And drones there are assemblages through and through. Parts are smuggled in from Thailand. They are taken apart and then brought back in after they pass the border. Some parts are recreated or created anew through 3D printing. It's this kind of collaging, bootstrapping of different parts to make a technology now. And I think that's definitely something to consider for drone futures. What will drones look like when increasingly it is governed actually by the motivations of people who are just trying to create something, trying to use it, right? That comes first before the procurement of the technology in the first place.
Will popular culture change that? Or how is popular culture shaping the way that drones are used in film or photography, or I don't know, what we might call capital C culture, but also lowercase culture too?
That's a good question. I think drones are part of everyday visual culture now. It's hard to look on Instagram or TikTok without seeing some kind of sublime view of a drone's eye view over a place in a very aestheticized way, right? So I think in popular culture, in the use of photography drones, for instance, it has opened up a new way of looking at ourselves and looking at the environment and the world from up above. And drones are also used in filmmaking and cinematography, and they've become real players in the way that helicopters were earlier in creating new ways of looking and new ways of identifying with visual images. So I think all of that is good. I think the way drones can tell stories because of their aesthetic dimensions, I think that is a good element. I think, again, my reservation might just be that we're living in a moment when this is new. And if I were to guess, in about 10, 15 years' time, drone shots will just become a part of everyday culture, right? Not a capital C anymore, but just a very, very small lowercase c. And will that have consequences for how stories are told? Will drones be used in popular culture because they are cheaper or because they are the best way to tell a story from up above or from below? Will drones be used as a gimmick or will they be used because there was no other way to capture a particular shot or a particular interpretation? That I don't know.
And I really find this quite compelling, the way that you've described how, drones are shaping not only like sort of the individual drone user or hobbyist's way of seeing, but actually all of us. And when we consume popular culture and media, yes, I've never flown a drone or used one, but I for sure have watched many a Netflix show with a very aggressive drone use. And it becomes like so normalized. And it wasn't really till I started working with you and our colleague Amy Gator that I started to become a little bit more cognizant of how that normalization was occurring and what are the knock-on political effects of that. I think Nicholas Mirzoev's White Site is really interesting for thinking about like the racial and political kind of dimensions of the popularization of this kind of top-down view. But I wanted to close by asking you about a particular modality of drone culture, which I know that you've written about, which is the drone light show. And so I wanted to ask, what is a drone light show? Have you ever seen one? And what do you think they show us about the aesthetics and the politics of drones?
I've seen a drone light show. Have you seen a drone light show?
I feel like I might have, but I feel like if I've seen one, it's been like a very small one. And so I feel like a spectacular event that I feel like really stuck in my memory. Or I've definitely seen a light projection show.
Dan tried to make me go to one in Dubai, and I was like, absolutely not. Like, no desire.
Yeah, I would gather that you have seen one, if not in person, then through media, right? Because increasingly drone light shows are part of major multinational events like the Olympics, for instance, or New Year's Day celebrations. It's interesting. Drone light shows are going through peaks and troughs, I think, not unlike VR, right? There was a hype around VR for a while, and then it died for a while, and then it's back for a while. And so drone light shows have been around for a while and have been hyped as the newest replacement to fireworks that might be more environmentally friendly, for instance, because it produces less smoke, might be friendlier for those with noise sensitivities and that kind of thing. But it hasn't actually taken off as much as I think it ought to or would have, or given all of the hype, I thought it would be much bigger than it is now. And I think it's because it cannot live up to this hype of transcendence, right? Drone light shows are essentially swarm drones that are pre-programmed to an algorithm to create a moving story. And sometimes the tableau changes very often, and sometimes it's quite static. But the idea is that you see lots and lots of drones in the sky, and together they create a kind of mosaic, portrait of something, and they tell a story through how the swarm comes together, right? So there's this very compelling understanding of cooperation and machine cooperation that's kind of being eked out in the sky as you're watching it. But if you actually go to a drone light show, it can feel quite pathetic. You're just looking at lights flying around. A lot of the experience of watching a drone light show is just waiting rather than feeling like something is being sublimated. So I think the idea of a sublime drone light show involving, thousands of flying robots creating a massive, cosmological picture in the sky. That all sounds really nice. And then the actual experience on the ground of you looking at it, not even being able to make out what the picture is doing, or in fact, sometimes the show getting canceled because of high winds or some kind of glitch or technological malfunction. That all brings the idea of the drone back to the ground as just things, as just objects that we've created. And so I'm really interested in that aspect of aesthetics, that aspect of popular culture, a light show, and how we can spin out and extrapolate these bigger questions about what we imagine machines and autonomous robots to be, our relationship to them. Do we think of them as something untouchable, beyond us, more than human, or do we actually think of them as tools, as things that fail all the time? That's that we might not be impressed by all the time. I'd love to see more drone light shows. I'd love to see better drone light shows. And I think it's worth you taking a look at them too and coming to your own decision about them.
Great. And I will get the good robot to fund my ticket. I will expense that as a work trip.
Sadly, they're very expensive to put on. I have thought about it before as a kind of experiment, but yes, it does require money.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show. And it's got me thinking of the qualitative aspect of storytelling, which you can't really get, in my view, from drones because they are a quantitative observational tool. They look at things at scale. And yeah, in that way, to me, they are substantively different from other ways of looking, making films, making pornography, making whatever it is, and observing the world that we live in. Thank you so much. There's so many things we could talk to you about today, but it's a pleasure to have you on.
Thank you so much for talking with me about this.
This episode was made possible thanks to the generosity of Christina Gore and the MacArthur Foundation. It was produced by Eleanor Drage and Kerry McInerney and edited by Eleanor Drage.